Winter settles hard on Illinois in 1942, and in a two-story house on the edge of Decatur, the Harper family hears their attic door creak open at 3 in the morning. Again, Margaret Harper lies awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the groan of old wood and the whisper of hinges that need oil. Her husband, Thomas, sleeps beside her, exhausted from his shift at the Staley processing plant, where corn becomes syrup for a nation at war. But Margaret cannot sleep. She cannot ignore the sounds. And she cannot shake the feeling that something in their home, in their lives, is coming apart at the seams. The house was built in 1898, a wedding gift from Thomas's father, who worked the railroads. It stands at the end of El Dorado Street, where the pavement crumbles into dirt and the street lights flicker in the wind. The structure has weathered 44 winters, and each one has left its mark. The foundation has settled unevenly over the decades, creating gaps in the door frames and cracks that spiderweb across the plaster walls. The attic door, hung from a simple latch mechanism, no longer sits flush with its frame. When the temperature drops and the house contracts, the door shifts, groans, and sometimes swings open on its own. Thomas knows this. He has explained it to Margaret dozens of times. The wood expands and contracts with the weather. The latch is loose. The floor beneath the door has warped slightly, creating an imbalance that pulls it open when conditions are right. It is not mysterious. It is not supernatural. It is simply an old house doing what old houses do. But Margaret does not find comfort in these explanations. She lies in bed and listens to the door swing open, and in her mind, she sees other things. She sees their son Daniel walking up the narrow staircase to the attic in the middle of the night. She sees him standing in the doorway, staring into the darkness. She sees him turning back toward them with questions in his eyes that she does not know how to answer. Daniel is 12 years old. He has his father's dark hair and his mother's nervous energy. He does not sleep well. He wakes in the night and walks through the house, his bare feet silent on the cold floorboards. Margaret has found him in the kitchen, in the hallway, in the living room, staring out the window at the empty street. When she asks him what he is doing, he says he does not know. When she asks him what he is looking for, he says nothing. But his eyes tell a different story. The war has changed everything. Rationing has made food scarce and expensive. Thomas works longer hours for the same pay, and the exhaustion shows in the lines around his eyes. Margaret takes in laundry to make ends meet, scrubbing other people's clothes in the basement while her own pile grows in the corner. Daniel has stopped going to school regularly. He says the other boys make fun of him because his father is not overseas fighting. He says they call him a coward son. Margaret does not know how to fix this. She does not know how to explain to her son that some men must stay home to keep the country running. She does not know how to make the attic door stop opening in the night. She only knows that something is wrong, and it is getting worse. The first time Daniel mentions the attic, it is a Sunday morning in late January. Snow covers the ground outside, and the kitchen smells of coffee and toast made from rationed bread. Thomas sits at the table reading the newspaper, his jaw tight as he scans the headlines about battles in North Africa and the Pacific. Margaret stands at the stove, stirring oatmeal that has gone thin because they are running low on milk. Daniel sits between them, picking at the sleeve of his sweater. He asks his father if the attic door is supposed to open by itself. Thomas does not look up from the newspaper. He says the house is old and the door does not latch properly. He says it is nothing to worry about. Daniel asks if there is anything in the attic that might make the door open. Thomas folds the newspaper and sets it down. He looks at his son with tired eyes and says there is nothing in the attic except old furniture and boxes. He says Daniel should stop thinking about it. But Daniel does not stop thinking about it. Over the following weeks, he becomes fixated on the attic. He asks Margaret if she has ever been up there. She tells him yes, many times, and there is nothing unusual to see. He asks if anyone has ever lived up there. She tells him no, it has always been used for storage. He asks if anyone has ever died up there. She pauses at this question, her hands stilling over the dishes in the sink. She tells him no, and her voice is sharp enough that he does not ask again. Thomas grows frustrated with Daniel's obsession. He tells his son to focus on his schoolwork, to help his mother with chores, to stop wandering around the house at night. But discipline does not work. Daniel grows quieter, more withdrawn. He sits at the dinner table and stares at the ceiling as if he can see through it to the attic above. He asks questions about the house's history, about the people who lived there before them, about whether old buildings remember the things that happen inside them. Margaret begins to worry in a way that goes deeper than the usual concerns of motherhood. She watches her son retreat into himself, and she wonders if the problem is not the house, but the world outside it. The war has made everyone anxious, everyone afraid. Families receive telegrams with news of sons killed in action. Neighbors whisper about rationing violations and black market dealings. The radio brings stories of cities bombed and ships sunk. Perhaps Daniel is simply absorbing all of this fear and turning it inward, translating it into something he can control: a creaking door, a dark attic, a mystery he can try to solve. She talks to Thomas about taking Daniel to see a doctor. Thomas says they cannot afford it. She suggests they talk to the priest. Thomas says religion will not fix what is wrong with their son. She asks what he thinks is wrong. Thomas stands up from the table, puts on his coat, and says he does not know. Then he leaves for work, and Margaret is alone with her fears and her son, who will not stop staring at the ceiling. February brings freezing rain and a darkness that settles over Decatur like a blanket. The streets turn to ice, and the factories slow their production because coal shipments are delayed. Thomas comes home from work earlier than usual, his hands red with cold, his breath visible in the air. The house is barely warm. They burn wood in the fireplace to save coal for cooking, and the smoke leaves a thin layer of ash on every surface. Daniel stops going to school entirely. The truancy officer visits the house twice, and each time Margaret makes excuses. She says her son is sick, that he will return when he is well. The officer looks skeptical, but does not press the issue. There are bigger problems in the world than one boy missing school. The war effort needs every able body, every scrap of metal, every ounce of resolve. One child's education seems insignificant by comparison. But for Margaret, nothing is more significant. She watches her son disappear into himself, and she feels helpless to stop it. He spends hours in his room with the door closed. When she knocks and enters, she finds him sitting on his bed, staring at the wall. She asks him what he is thinking about. He says nothing. She asks him if he wants to talk. He says no. She sits beside him and puts her hand on his shoulder, and he does not pull away, but he does not respond either. He is there and not there, present in body, but absent in spirit. Thomas loses patience. One evening, he marches upstairs and opens Daniel's door without knocking. He tells his son that this behavior stops now. He says Daniel will return to school, will do his chores, will stop acting like the world is ending. Daniel looks at his father with eyes that are too old for his face and says maybe the world is ending. Thomas raises his voice. He says men are dying overseas so that Daniel can have a future, and the least the boy can do is show some gratitude by living his life. Daniel says maybe those men are dying for nothing. The silence that follows is terrible. Thomas stands in the doorway, his fists clenched, his face flushed with anger and something deeper, fear, perhaps, or despair. Margaret appears behind him, her hand on his arm, pulling him gently away. She closes Daniel's door and leads Thomas downstairs. They do not speak. They sit in the kitchen in the dim light of a single lamp, and Margaret makes tea they cannot afford because she does not know what else to do. That night, the attic door opens again. Margaret hears it from the bedroom, the familiar creak of hinges, followed by the soft thud of wood against the hallway wall. She gets out of bed and walks into the hallway. The door is open, and beyond it, the darkness of the attic yawns like a mouth. She reaches up to close it, but something stops her. She stands there, looking into the darkness, and for the first time, she understands her son's fixation. There is something about the space that demands attention, that insists on being acknowledged. It is not supernatural. It is not haunted. But it is not empty either. The disappearance happens on a Thursday. Margaret wakes to find Daniel's bed empty, the blankets thrown back, the window closed and latched from the inside. She calls his name. She searches the house. She checks the basement, the kitchen, the living room. Thomas wakes and joins the search, moving through the rooms with growing urgency. They find no sign of their son. The attic door is open. Margaret climbs the narrow stairs with Thomas behind her. The space is cramped and cold, filled with old furniture covered in sheets and boxes stacked against the walls. Dust hangs in the air, illuminated by the weak morning light filtering through a small window. They search through everything, calling Daniel's name, hoping to find him hiding among the relics of the past. But he is not there. Thomas runs outside. He searches the yard, the street, the neighbor's property. He shouts Daniel's name into the frozen morning air. Margaret stays inside, moving from room to room, opening closets and cupboards, looking under beds and behind doors. She finds nothing. Her son has vanished as completely as if he never existed. By noon, the police are involved. 2 officers come to the house and ask questions. They want to know if Daniel had any friends he might have gone to, any relatives who lived nearby, any reason to run away. Margaret and Thomas answer as best they can, but the truth is they do not know. Their son had become a stranger to them in the weeks before he disappeared, a quiet presence in their home whose thoughts and feelings remained locked away. The officers search the house and the surrounding area. They interview neighbors. They put out a bulletin with Daniel's description. They tell Margaret and Thomas not to lose hope, that most missing children are found within 48 hours. But there's something in their voices, a hesitation, that suggests they do not believe their own reassurances. That evening, Margaret sits in Daniel's room. She touches his things, his school books, his clothes, the wooden toy soldiers he has not played with in years. She tries to remember the last thing she said to him, the last time she looked into his eyes and really saw him. But the memories blur together into a long stretch of days where she was too busy, too tired, too worried about money and the war and the 100 small crises that make up daily life. She took her son for granted, assumed he would always be there, and now he is gone. Thomas sits downstairs in the dark. He does not turn on the lights. He does not move. He sits in his chair and stares at the wall, and Margaret knows he is blaming himself. She wants to go to him, to tell him it is not his fault, but she cannot, because part of her does blame him. Part of her blames herself. Part of her blames the house, the war, the world that has become so cruel and unpredictable. The attic door remains open, and neither of them goes to close it. The search for Daniel Harper consumes Decatur for 3 days. Volunteers comb through the neighborhoods, calling his name, checking abandoned buildings, searching the frozen banks of the Sangamon River. The police interview everyone who knew the family, looking for clues, connections, explanations. Margaret sits in her living room and answers the same questions over and over until the words lose meaning. Did Daniel seem upset? Yes. Did he mention running away? No. Did anyone threaten him? Not that she knows. Were there problems at home? She hesitates at this question, and the officer writes something in his notebook that she cannot see. Thomas does not sleep. He drives through the city at night with a flashlight, stopping at places Daniel might have gone, the schoolyard, the park, the train depot, where hobos gather around barrow fires. He shows Daniel's photograph to strangers who shake their heads and turn away. He checks with relatives in Springfield and Champaign, hoping his son somehow made it to their doorsteps. But no one has seen the boy. No one knows where he might be. On the 4th day, the search begins to lose momentum. The volunteers return to their own lives and their own problems. The police scale back their efforts, assigning only one officer to follow up on occasional leads that go nowhere. The newspapers run a story on page 3 with Daniel's school photograph and a plea for information. Margaret cuts out the article and puts it in her Bible, though she has not prayed in months. The house feels different now. Every room carries the weight of absence. Margaret walks through the hallways and sees her son's ghost in every corner. Daniel at the kitchen table, Daniel on the stairs, Daniel standing in front of the attic door with his hand on the frame. She begins to understand that grief is not one emotion, but many, layered and contradictory. She feels sadness, yes, but also anger at her son for leaving, at Thomas for not fixing whatever was broken, at herself for not seeing the signs earlier. She feels guilt for every moment she was too busy or too tired to really listen. She feels fear that Daniel is cold, hungry, hurt, or worse. And underneath everything else, she feels a terrible, gnawing uncertainty that is worse than any definite knowledge could be. Thomas becomes obsessed with the idea that Daniel hopped a freight train. He spends his free time at the rail yards, talking to conductors and brakemen, asking if they have seen a boy matching his son's description. Some are sympathetic and promise to keep watch. Others are dismissive, saying hundreds of people ride the rails illegally and one boy is indistinguishable from another. Thomas shows Daniel's photograph to workers in Bloomington, Springfield, Peoria. He travels on his days off, following rail lines, checking depots, chasing rumors and possibilities. Margaret pursues a different theory. She believes Daniel is still in Decatur, hiding somewhere close. She thinks of places a child might go to feel safe: the library, the church basement, abandoned buildings near the river. She walks through the city with flyers, taping them to telephone poles and shop windows. She talks to homeless men who gather at soup kitchens, asking if they have seen a boy alone. She visits orphanages and youth shelters, thinking Daniel might have presented himself as abandoned. But every lead ends in disappointment. Every possibility evaporates under scrutiny. Spring arrives, and with it comes a slow shift in how the community views the Harper family. At first, people were sympathetic, offering help and prayers. But as weeks turn to months with no resolution, sympathy curdles into something else: speculation, judgment, whispered theories. Some neighbors suggest the Harpers were neglectful parents, that Daniel ran away because of abuse or indifference. Others hint at darker possibilities, wondering if the police investigated the family thoroughly enough. Margaret feels these judgments like physical blows. She stops going to church because she cannot bear the pitying looks and the careful distance people maintain. Thomas hears rumors at work that he had something to do with Daniel's disappearance, that the search is a performance designed to deflect suspicion. One afternoon, a co-worker confronts him directly, asking if Thomas heard his son. Thomas does not answer with words. He swings his fist and breaks the man's nose, and the fight that follows gets them both suspended for a week. Thomas sits at home during his suspension, staring at walls, drinking whiskey he cannot afford, sinking deeper into a despair that Margaret cannot reach. The marriage fractures under the weight of loss and accusation. They sleep in separate rooms. They communicate through necessity rather than affection. They exist in the same space, but inhabit different worlds of grief. Margaret blames Thomas for not being emotionally available to their son. Thomas blames Margaret for coddling Daniel instead of toughening him up. Both blame themselves but cannot articulate this guilt, so they project it outward, onto each other, onto the town, onto the circumstances that conspired to take their child from them. In May, 6 months after Daniel disappeared, the police officially closed the case. They file the paperwork, archive the reports, and move on to other investigations. The detective tells Margaret and Thomas that the case remains open in the sense that new information would be investigated, but active searching has concluded. He says they did everything possible, followed every lead, explored every avenue. He says sometimes people disappear and are never found, and that is a reality families must learn to accept. Margaret asks how she is supposed to accept that her son is gone without knowing where or why. The detective has no answer. Summer 1943 arrives with oppressive heat. The war continues overseas with victories in North Africa and preparations for an invasion of Italy. Rationing grows stricter, and the news is filled with casualty reports and calls for more production, more sacrifice, more resolve. The Harpers move through this changed world like ghosts, present but not participating, alive but not living. Margaret makes a decision. She cannot continue in the house where Daniel disappeared. Every room carries too many memories. Every sound echoes with his absence. She tells Thomas they need to move to start over somewhere else. Thomas says running away will not bring their son back. Margaret says staying will not either. They argue, but the fight has gone out of both of them. Finally, Thomas agrees. They put the house on the market in July. The process of packing reveals how much they accumulated over the years. Margaret sorts through clothes, dishes, furniture, making piles for sale and charity. She finds Daniel's things in every corner: a marble under the couch, a drawing stuffed behind a radiator, a sock beneath the bathroom sink. Each discovery is a small wound that reopens the grief. She packs these items separately, carefully, as if they are sacred relics. She cannot keep everything, but she cannot throw anything away either. The attic requires 2 full days to clear. Margaret and Thomas work together in awkward silence, carrying boxes down the narrow stairs, discovering objects neither remembers storing. They find the journal where Margaret left it, and Thomas picks it up and puts it in his pocket. They find Daniel's toy soldiers arranged in battle formation on a dusty shelf. Neither of them remembers the boy playing in the attic, but the evidence suggests he spent time there, creating worlds in the dim light while his parents lived their lives below. A young couple buys the house in August. They are newlyweds, excited about their first home. The husband works at the same Staley plant as Thomas. The wife is pregnant, due in December. They walk through the rooms with enthusiasm, planning where furniture will go, what colors to paint the walls. Margaret watches them and feels a strange mixture of envy and pity. They are starting their lives together, full of hope and possibility. They do not know the house's history, and Margaret does not tell them. Let them discover their own ghosts, she thinks. Let them create their own memories, happy or sad. The Harpers move to a small apartment near downtown. It is cramped, impersonal, utterly unlike the house they left. But anonymity has its advantages. Their new neighbors do not know about Daniel. The landlord does not ask questions. They can reinvent themselves, or at least pretend to. Thomas finds work at a different factory. Margaret takes a job at a department store, selling fabric and notions to women who discuss their families without awareness of how their happiness cuts. They do not speak of Daniel. His name becomes a silence between them, an absence they navigate around in daily conversations. His photograph sits on Margaret's dresser, but she covers it with a cloth because looking at it has become unbearable. Thomas keeps the journal in a drawer, unopened. They construct a life around the hole their son left, and slowly, painfully, they learn to function in this new reality. Years pass. The war ends. Soldiers return home. The economy shifts from military production to peacetime manufacturing. Decatur grows and changes. The Harpers grow older, grayer, quieter. They never have another child. They never find out what happened to Daniel. He remains forever 12 years old, forever missing, forever a question, without an answer. In 1955, 13 years after Daniel disappeared, Margaret receives a letter. It is postmarked from Seattle, and the return address belongs to someone she does not know. She opens it with trembling hands. Inside is a brief note and a photograph. The note says a man matching Daniel's description was seen working on the docks, that he called himself by a different name but resembled the photograph from the missing persons report. The writer, a former Decatur resident, thought Margaret should know. The photograph shows a young man in his 20s, lean and weathered, staring at the camera with wary eyes. Margaret studies the face for hours, searching for her son in the stranger's features. She sees similarities, the shape of the jaw, the set of the eyes. But she cannot be certain. Time changes people, and 13 years is an eternity. She shows the photograph to Thomas. He looks at it for a long time, then hands it back and says he does not know. Margaret writes to the return address, begging for more information. The letter is returned, marked addressee unknown. She contacts authorities in Seattle, but they have no record of the man. The lead evaporates, leaving her with a photograph and an impossible question. Is this her son, alive and choosing to stay away? Or is it a stranger who happens to look like the boy she lost? Margaret never knows. She dies in 1962, the photograph among her possessions. Thomas follows in 1965. They are buried in Greenwood Cemetery under a shared headstone that lists their names and dates. With space left for the child, they never stop mourning. And somewhere in Seattle or elsewhere, alive or dead, remembering or having forgotten, Daniel Harper's story continues or ended, but the truth remains locked away, another mystery in a world full of them. The attic door in the old house still opens on its own, responding to temperature changes and the settling of old wood, making new families wonder and worry, never knowing the grief that once filled those rooms, or the boy who disappeared one night in 1942, leaving behind only questions and a journal full of loneliness.
Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.